I'm not sure exactly where you're from. So I'm sorry. I went to another one. The line was down the road today. They were everybody getting the grandma push hard from this ice so that the next ice can come. Grab them up again.
Spiritual, religious,
All right. Thank y'all for being here. It's good to see you here. We are studying the book of Leviticus, and I had a really good, nobody else called it good but me, visual presentation for you last week, and I don't have near as much visual presentation for you this week. Tonight, Lord willing, we're going to get into the text. But the book of Leviticus is born out of our theme this year, which comes from 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, because it's written, "You shall be holy as I am holy," or "for I am holy," which is a quote from actually several different places in Leviticus. But Leviticus explains what it takes for people who have sinned, people who have been defiled and polluted, to interact with a holy God. And I want to follow up on this just a little bit tonight before we jump into the text, and remind you just a little bit about what we talked about. God is holy and his people must be holy, the theme of Leviticus. But I want you to notice here, chapter 11, verse 44. This is part of the dietary laws. This is part of what you can eat, what you can't eat. "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy." Consecrate yourselves. Shall not make yourselves unclean. You see these terms over and over and over again in the book of Leviticus. And I want to talk about them just a little bit. I want to show you another example. So this one right here gives an outline of the book. And tonight and next week, if the Lord allows, we're going to talk about chapters 1 through 7. I'm only expecting to get through chapters 1 and 2 tonight because this little introduction I'm going to do first of all. And then, Lord willing, next week we'll do chapters 3 through 7. But that is offset by the feasts in chapters 23 through 25. And then you come a little closer to the middle of the book, chapters 8 through 10, you have the ordination of priests, the installation of priests, another word for ordination. And that is then offset or connected to the qualifications of priests, which don't come until chapters 21 and 22. And then we just read chapter 11 where it talks about what you can eat. That's part of ritual purity. That's part of keeping yourself religiously or ritually pure so that you can interact with God, which is connected to moral purity, which is like sin. It's like sexual instructions and theft and dishonest scales and how you treat the poor, moral purity. All of these things revolve around and are sort of enlightened by chapter 16 and 17, which is the Day of Atonement, because the whole book is about atonement. And I want to talk about that just a little bit tonight. And we're going to talk about it quite a bit when we get into the actual text. And then the end, a call to faithfulness, chapter 26 and 27. So this again is the outline of the book, just in a different place, so that you see how the different parts of the book balance themselves in a really interesting and beautiful way. So I want to go back to these terms. So I want you to imagine where and when Leviticus is written. Leviticus is written at the foot of Mount Sinai, where the Ten Commandments were received, when God calls to Moses from the tent of meeting. It's called the tent of meeting because that's where you meet God. It's only called the tent of meeting, in these books. Later, it's just called the tabernacle. Tabernacle means tent, but tent of meeting really refers to the fact that this is where you meet God. But if you look in Exodus and Numbers, what you see is the tribes of Israel are grouped into 4 different groups. You have a group of 3, a group of 3, a group of 3, and a group of 3. And then you have the Levites, because Joseph is divided into 2, which sort of makes 13 tribes, which is interesting. You get to the New Testament and Judas gets replaced and you sort of have 13 apostles. But they camp in a certain direction, and in the middle is the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, where you interact with God. And so Leviticus is really written in the middle of the time where these people who have come out of Egypt are learning how to live in a camp that revolves around the place where you interact with God. And so their entire lives revolve around the tabernacle, which is symbolic of your entire life revolving around God, right? And how do you do that? Well, God says, you shall be holy, for I am holy. He says, don't defile yourselves. He says, don't make yourselves unclean. He says, consecrate yourselves. And so I'm going to give you an idea of what these things mean. And this is not a perfect representation, but it is what one commentator suggested. His name is Wenham, Gordon Wenham. He's a respected biblical scholar, and I created this on my own, but this is how he explains it. He says, in its natural state, everything is common. So you're common, a spoon is common, a bowl is common, a cow is common, a piece of metal is common, just it's regular. And God is holy, but then things associated with death and sickness and disease are unclean. And so then you have these terms that talk about moving between the different categories. To go from common to holy, you have to be sanctified. Sanctification moves from the common to the holy. Defilement moves from the holy back to the common. It can move to the common, or actually, I should have drawn a thing down here. It can move all the way to the unclean, right? If you're unclean because you've touched something dead, or because of whatever reason, to become common again, you have to be purified. There has to be a cleansing. But if you are just living your regular life and you touch a dead thing or a thing that's prohibited, or you commit a sin, that's pollution that brings you into unclean. And so what you see in Leviticus, it really, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is you see this constant movement of people in and out of these different categories. Now, my reading of Leviticus, this is not a perfect representation. Defilement doesn't always mean from holy to common. Sometimes defilement can mean from common to unclean. The word pollution has a bunch of different phrases, none of which are really pollution. Purification has different words. Cleansed sometimes purified. Different translations will do it different ways. So this is not a perfect thing, but the real thing that this sort of helps you understand is that there is in some sense a difference between cleansing or purification and sanctification. That's what this really sort of captures, the truth of what Leviticus says. So there are in chapters 1 through 7 5 different basic types of sacrifice. And so tonight we're going to try to talk about the first 2. The first one, chapter 1, is the burnt offering. Chapter 2 is the grain offering. The not the Old Testament, the King James, which I sort of think of as the Old Testament. Joe. The King James word is the cereal offering, or some of the older translations, cereal offering, but it means that which comes from grain, that which comes from wheat or barley or rye or whatever kind of grain you might have. The burnt offering is the most common type of offering. And in chapter 1, you have verses 1 and 2 are sort of the introduction. Chapters 3 through 9, the burnt offering, if it's cattle, verses 3 through 9. Verses 10 through 13, the burnt offering, if it's sheep or goats. And then verses 14 through 17, if it's birds. And so a burnt offering can be a bull from the herd of, bovine. It can be a sheep, it can be a goat, or it can be a bird. And it's a bird if you're poor, if you can't afford a sheep or a goat. But burnt offerings, you see this later, it's not exactly recorded. And what's interesting, to understand this, Leviticus is an explanation to people in the middle of living. They're living in this camp, looking at this tabernacle, and they're getting the instructions as they go along. And so it's not sat down to be a dictionary of religious, Jewish religion. It is a right now what you need to be doing kind of book. And so we're trying to take it now, and so it doesn't sit down and explain to you this is the purpose of a burnt offering. And Leviticus doesn't even start out by saying, hey, there's going to be a burnt offering every morning and every afternoon, and on feast days, there's going to be 7. But that's exactly what it is. They already know that, or they're going to learn that in the practice of time as they learn about the feasts. And so it's explaining to people what they need to know now, and then explaining to them later what they need to know later. Okay? Burnt offerings, though, are offered twice a day, just on a regular Wednesday, right? And then on Sabbaths, there's more. On the feast days, there's more. And some of the feasts that last a week, there's more every day. The reason it's called a burnt offering is because they burn everything. And there's a little bit of an exception, which we can see in here about that. But none of it is eaten. The sin offering, the guilt offering, the grain offering, and the peace offering, which are the other 4, the peace or the fellowship offering, all of those, at least in part, and some of them in total are eaten, or almost in total are eaten. The burnt offering, none of it is eaten. And so that's why it's a burnt offering, because it is consumed by the fire. And what that means is the other 4 sacrifices are not all burned in fire and destroyed by fire. Okay? Let's read chapter 1. Oh, I don't have to do all the reading anymore because we got a good microphone. Who would like to read Leviticus chapter 1 for me?
Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying, Can we keep going?
Yes, roll on.
Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd, and of the flock. If his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. Then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He shall kill the bull before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood all around on the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And he shall skin the burnt offering and cut it into its pieces. The sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and lay the wood in order on the fire. Then the priests, Aaron's sons, shall lay the parts, the head, and the fat in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But he shall wash its entrails and its legs with water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar as a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. If his offering is of the flocks, of the sheep, or of the goats, as a burnt sacrifice, he shall bring a male without blemish. He shall kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall sprinkle its blood all around the altar. Oh, hold on, turn 2 pages. And he shall cut it into its pieces with its head and its fat, and the priest shall lay them in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But he shall wash the entrails and the legs with water. Then the priest shall bring it all and burn it on the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. And if the burnt sacrifice of his offering to the Lord is of birds, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or young pigeons. The priest shall bring it to the altar, wring off its head, and burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained out at the side of the altar. And he shall remove its crop with its feathers and cast it beside the altar on the east side into the place for ashes. Then he shall split it at its wings, but shall not divide it completely. And the priest shall burn it on the altar on the wood that is on the fire. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord.
Thank you, Melanie.
Welcome.
Okay, now, there,
Is David Whitehead here?
She teaches.
Also teaches. I just want to hear her keys back because Brenda went with Judy. I don't want Debbie to think something happened to Brenda.
is there an issue with Pat?
Yeah, she's just feeling really bad. She said she probably tried to do too much, too fast. Yeah, so, anyway, okay.
Thank you, Terry. So when you read Leviticus, it can seem repetitive and really detailed and really specific, right? One of the reasons I wanted to read this entire chapter is to sort of illustrate that, because what you got is you got a description of burnt offerings, and when you read the first verse or the first 2 verses, you can think, okay, it can only come from the herd, but it's not. It's giving you alternatives for a burnt offering all the way through. It's just giving the specifics about how you do these things, and that is pretty interesting. But I want to go through a couple of the details. I want to point out a couple of things to you, and then I really just want to get to the purpose. I want to get to a little bit of New Testament, and then I want to get to chapter 2. First of all, what are the characteristics of the animal supposed to have?
No blemish,
No blemish. What does that mean?
basically perfect specimen.
Perfect specimen. What would that, well, how else might we say that?
Best of the best.
Best of the best you've got, right? Really, best of the best is probably better, but at the very least, it's the best you've got, right? Why do you think God asks for that?
Well, for one thing, it'd be easy to sacrifice a sickly animal that was no value that was gonna die possibly or whatever, or if it died. In this case, it specifies you couldn't offer a dead animal, it has to be brought alive to be slain before the altar, so. But that would be an easy way to get rid of the bad herd.
Right, and they're criticized for that in, I think it's Malachi. I didn't write down this, but you're bringing me the sick and the lame from your herds and your flocks. Anybody here grow up as a child only eating meat infrequently? For often going days without eating meat. Cindy? Ken, you ate meat every day growing up? You can't hear me, can you?
For me,
Yeah,
we raised our own
yeah,
and stuff like that. There may have been, naturally a few days we didn't have them, but
yeah. Most of the time.
we had it. I grew up on a farm. We wrung the necks of the chickens. Any of you guys ever do that?
I tried, I failed.
And things like that.
Yeah.
My mom would cook chicken and dumplings. I wouldn't eat the dumplings. I ate the chicken.
Well, my parents both tell a story, but my dad specifically, that they would usually have meat once a week. And sometimes, they would have the lesser cuts or the leftover cuts that, they would grind up and make a hash or something, but they would frequently go days without having meat. And that's just because they didn't have enough. It was precious. It cost a lot. And if you killed one often enough to have it every day, you have no meat pretty soon. Well, 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago is when this was, it was even worse, right? And it was customary that you killed meat fairly infrequently and you tried to stretch it and make it go as far as it would. And so when you think of Noah coming off the ark, how many of each clean animal did he have? 7. What did he do when they landed on dry ground and they opened the door of the ark? He made a sacrifice. There's 7 in the world, and he killed one. Maybe more than one. Maybe one of multiple species, right? It's giving up something precious. It's giving up something valuable. That's what God is asking. That's what God is instructing here. Now, verse 4, 5, and 6. Who is conducting the activity? Nope.
Is it the high priest?
Verse 7 and 8, who is conducting the activity?
Sons of Aaron.
The sons of Aaron, who are. So who is that before in verses 4, 5, and 6?
Whoever brought the offering.
Whoever brought the offering. I never knew that until I started preparing for this class. When you took your sacrifice to the tabernacle is a big tent, right? Similar to the size of this building. It may be as big as this building. It may not be as big as this building. Certainly as big as this wing of this building. Not as wide, probably, but maybe as long. But you come in to the front part, and that's where you kill it. You kill it. You gut it. You cut it up into pieces. And then the priest takes the blood and pours it on the side of the altar. Then the priest takes the pieces and put it on top of the altar. But you're the one who takes the entrails, that means the intestines and the bladder and all that stuff. You wash all of that uncleanness, all of that filth off the meat. And then you take the meat to the priest. And what we're doing here is we are separating the unclean and we're washing it so that it can go to the consecrated one, the priest. That's what's happening. And I never knew that you had to kill it yourself. But you think about that. You think about you come to church and you're the one. Everybody who comes to worship, you're the one who has to do all the work, has to do the worst part of the work. And that's your worship. Or it's your dad doing it, right? Or it's your husband doing it. That's a really personal experience. You're bringing one of the most valuable things that you own, and you're killing it with your bare hands, getting blood and guts on you, and then you're handing it over to God's representative to burn up completely. That's what this is a picture of. That's what's really happening here. And it's a little bit astounding. Somebody turn and read Leviticus chapter 17. This is in the section on the Day of Atonement. Leviticus chapter 17, verses 3 and 4.
Anyone from the house of Israel who slaughters an ox, a lamb, or a goat in the camp, or slaughters it outside the camp, and has not brought it to the doorway of the tent of the meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, bloodshed is to be counted against that person. He has shed blood, and that person shall be cut off from among his people.
What does that mean? Summarize that for us.
Well, you're not to slaughter it outside the camp and then bring it in. You're supposed to do it right there at the doorway of the tent of meeting.
Every slice of meat that you eat is supposed to be sacrificed at the tent. This is the only place meat comes from. Now, not the burnt offering. That's not burnt offering that he's describing there. That's the fellowship offering, the peace offering. But now you're getting down into the section of ritual purity and moral purity and cleanliness, right? But God is now intimately involved in your daily sustenance. And a portion of every animal that you slaughter for any purpose is going to go to God, going to go to God's use at the tabernacle. And so your whole life, your very sustenance revolves around the tabernacle and your interaction with God. You're going to live in God's camp. These are the rules. That's what's happening here. If you're going to interact with me, everything that you do here is going to include me and involve me.
Gary,
Yes, sir.
did those who brought the birds get to eat some of the meat of the other people? Or the bird wouldn't feed them?
It is possible. There is passages in the peace offering, it's also called the fellowship offering, the alliance offering, that you can share that with the sojourner, the stranger, the widow, the poor. That was a part of it. And you were required to eat it all within 2 days. And so if you had too much, you would almost certainly share it. And there's provisions for families to go together and divide it too. I think that's with the Passover.
I'm just thinking this is daily food. And if you're poor and all you got's a bird, you wouldn't get much food unless you got it somewhere.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't get much meat. These people didn't eat much meat. They did not eat much meat. And that's part of the point. And the world over, for most of history, meat has been an infrequent thing for people. I mean, the abundance of food that we have is unimaginable to most of history. Unimaginable. And most of the rest of the world, even today. A lot of the rest of the world. Okay. Verses 3 and 4 again. What is the purpose of the burnt offering as it's described here? What's that?
Yep.
To accomplish what?
Atonement.
Atonement. How else does it describe it? In verse 3,
Well, they may be accepted before the Lord.
accepted, that he may be accepted. Verses 9, 13, and 17 have a repeated idea. What is the idea that's repeated in those verses? I think it may be also
Soothing aroma to the Lord.
a soothing aroma. I think that's also, yeah, verse 9 is the cattle. So it's in all the different kinds of animals. 9, 13, and 17 is the different versions of the offering that you can do. Who does it soothe?
God.
God. Atonement here is a very important concept. And here we're going to talk about one aspect of it, but the other aspect of it is going to be covered in the sin offering and the guilt offering. And hopefully we'll talk about those next week. But the aspect of atonement that the sin offering and the guilt offering address is cleansing. And the word for atonement can mean to wash or to pour off, to pour out. But it's the idea to remove. But in other places, you have a different use. I was hoping that I wrote them down. Okay. The other sense that's really being talked about here, when you're talking about a soothing aroma, and you're talking about, I already forgot, I keep forgetting the term, be accepted by God, is you're talking about sort of a ransom. You're talking about, look at verse 4 again. I meant to point this out earlier. It says, he shall lay his hand on the head. Do we have any other translations for that? This is the worshiper, the person who brings the animal, is to lay his hand on the head. Does anybody have a different translation? Okay. The idea here is not to just rest my hand on something. It's actually to press. And one way to think about it is to lean or to hold is the image of the word more clearly. It's not just to put to place, but to press with force. The idea is two symbols. One symbol is, I want you to take this animal in my stead. I'm putting me on his head. And so when you take him, it's as if you were taking me. It's a ransom. The other one is, I'm putting my sins on this animal. And you take this animal to expiate my sins. And so what the burnt offering is it's not a cleansing like the sin offering or the guilt offering. They're specifically designed to address sins, but this is also specifically designed to soothe God, to atone for us, and to make us acceptable to God. And so the idea is we recognize that a death must take place. A shedding of blood must take place in order for us to have a relationship with God. In order for us to interact with a holy God, our sins have to be dealt with, and the only way to deal with that is the shedding of blood and death. And that is our acknowledgement and of our need to deal with our sin, and that our sin would otherwise create a separation.
Carry the scapegoat, carried people's sins into the wilderness.
We'll get there. We're not there. We're not there yet, right? It's a very similar thing, but it's also in Leviticus. But the burnt offering, most common, twice a day, more on feast days, but you also come and do your own when you're doing your own sacrifices, you also make one. It's a general type thing, but it's an acknowledgement from the people that they need to deal with their sin and that it requires great value, the shedding of blood and the taking of life to deal with it. That's what's being ingrained in God's people by this offering. And it's a very bloody thing. And it's a very visceral, both literally and figuratively thing. Okay. Mark chapter, are you kidding me? This is not going to work. Mark chapter 10:45, Jesus says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to
Give his life as a ransom for many.
give his life a ransom for many. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2. Somebody read that for us because I can't quote it. 2. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2.
Walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma.
Christ gave himself as what?
Fragrant offering.
An offering and a sweet aroma, a fragrant aroma, right? A soothing aroma, same thing in Leviticus 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Somebody read that, they're short. I can almost quote it, but I'll mess it up.
18 and 19. Knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot.
You see the connections, right? The sacrifice, this burnt offering, is a precursor to Jesus. Ephesians chapter 7, verse 27. Hebrews, Jennifer. You're always pointing out my mistakes. Sorry. Hebrews chapter. Very quickly, Jennifer realized Ephesians doesn't have a chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 27. Thank you, Jennifer. I would never have figured that out.
Still been looking for.
Yeah. Who's got that?
Who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices first for his own sins and then for the people's. For this he did once for all when he offered up himself.
How often did the priest do it? Which sacrifice was made daily? The burnt offering. The sin offerings were probably made daily, but not for everybody, not generally. But that really sort of mixes the burnt offering and the Day of Atonement offerings, which he makes first for himself and then for the people. But he didn't do those daily. He did those once a year. And Hebrews makes that clear. But he makes this atonement offering daily, twice a day. Jesus only needed to do it once. Now come to Hebrews chapter 13. Now, before we read this, Hebrews chapter 13, I felt like it said 19 after it came out of my mouth. There's no 19. Here's the deal. What I was going to tell you, and what I will tell you again next week, when you get to the grain offering, with the grain offering, only a little bit of the grain, only literally a handful, is burned on the altar. And the rest of the grain offering, generally, when it's associated with the burnt offering, belongs to the priest. And so the priest is getting bread and grain every time somebody comes and makes a grain offering, which pretty much always goes with the burnt offering. The grain offering is an expression of gratitude and thanksgiving. And so once you have atonement, once you have been consecrated, you've been purified, atoned for, sanctified. Now you can offer worship to a holy God. The burnt offering is a form of worship, but it's about atonement. And then you're able to express gratitude. Then you're able to express thanksgiving. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 7.
Remember those who led you, who spoke the word of God to you, and considering the result of their way of life.
I'm sorry, Stan, I gave you the wrong verse. Verse 15.
Through him, then, let's continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips praising his name.
Grain offering was about gratitude. Now we express gratitude with our mouths. We worship vocally. What do you think fruit of lips refers to most specifically?
Singing.
Singing. Sacrifice of praise. That is the fruit of lips that give thanks to his name. And so our worship, we'll do this again next week. Our worship is similar to an echo of the worship of the tabernacle, the grain offering, which follows the atonement of the burnt offering. The burnt offering gets you ready for that. The sin offering, the guilt offering do so in a different way. This is ransom, that's going to be cleansing. Okay?
Jerry, does the priest always get a share of what was offered?
They get a different portion of different sacrifices. They get no portion of the burnt offering. None for the priest.
Except the grain?
They get a portion of every other offering. They get the lion's share of the grain offering. They get a portion of the sin offering. They get a portion of the guilt offering, and they get a fairly small portion of the fellowship
That's
offering.
what made me think of it, was the grain offering. But one thing I'd like to ask you is, if you'll remind me what it was. By the time you quit, I think of it. Oh, the aroma thing, the sweet aroma.
Yeah.
Do you think that was actual? Didn't they use some in the New Testament when they don't actually do a killing of something, that it comes up as a sweet offering to the Lord? I think that's probably talking about makes him happy or pleasing, or
It's
not actually an actual smell.
I don't know if I can answer your question in the way you're asking it, Don. Maybe I don't know the answer, but let me give you a different slant on it, which maybe will satisfy the question in your mind. In Genesis 35, 37, somewhere like that, Jacob has been in Padan Aram with Laban. He has gotten his 2 wives and his 2 concubines. He now has 11 of his 12 sons. And then he leaves Laban and he travels back to Canaan. And he's worried that Esau still wants to kill him. And so what does Jacob do?
Somebody take a bunch of animals as an offering.
He sends servants ahead of him with 12 goats and with 12 sheep and 3, donkeys and camels, and one right after another, to try to appease Esau and to try to assuage Esau's anger at Jacob having stolen his birthright or stolen his blessing from Isaac. And atonement is similar to that, but appeasement or expiation or propitiation, those words are really well illustrated by that. And so what you're doing is you're taking this earthly idea, this idea that people of that time had, that if you offend somebody, if you do something wrong, you give them something of value to assuage their anger, and so that they won't try to exact more vengeance on you, more justice from you. That's atonement, right? To make up for, at least to some extent, what you've done. And so the only thing they understand is that kind of thing. And so I've killed this animal, I've offered it to you, it's cooking just for you. That's the aroma. You smell it. When you cook an animal with fat on it, man, you can smell that with wood for a couple of miles. You drive by a barbecue place, you're like, I'm hungry, right? It's not that the smell actually has that impact on the infinite God, but that's what people understand. That's what they understand. And that's the picture of the offerings,
I
especially.
think it's God saying, when you obey my commands, it is really, it comes up to me as a reflection.
It's how you deal with my anger. That's right. It's how you change my mood and my attitude towards you. Right? Brian, will you close us with a prayer? Wait, sorry, Michelle wants to talk.
No, I don't. Terry asked me to make an announcement. The poinsettia, or however you want to say that word,
But I hear you.
yeah, the flowers that are red in there in auditoriums. If you would like to take one, take it.
I knew a lady one time who could keep a poinsettia alive until the next Christmas. I've never lived in a house with anybody who can do it, but I've heard it's, if you want a poinsettia, give one in the auditorium.
My 10th grade English teacher taught us that.
Okay. Brian, will you close us with a prayer, please?
Dear gracious Lord and Heavenly Father, this day, Lord, many blessings you give to us. Lord, we're especially thankful for spare lives once again to gather here and to study your word, Lord. And I pray that we'll take what we've learned here this evening and apply it to our daily lives so that we stronger Christians in the future than we have been in the past. Lord, I pray for the sick that were mentioned earlier, Lord, that if your will, that we return to the much of health. Lord, I pray that you forgive us our sins and bring us back to the next point in time. In Christ's name, we pray.
Amen. Thank y'all for being here.
Next 3 days.